everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, a show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing, and very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, or it's a Rejoinder episode, which this is. This month we are rejoined by Danika Stegeman LeMay. Her second book, Ablation, was published by 1111 Press, and that's the book we're talking about today. Her book Pilot from 2020 was published by Spork Press. She's a 2023 recipient of a grant from the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund and recently spent a 2-week residency in Marathon, Texas, outside Big Bend National Park. Before we get into my conversation with Danika, I'll remind you that you can support this show financially. You can do it at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe for a one-time donation, or you can become a recurring patron at patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. For just $2 a month, you can get these episodes when I'm done editing them, rather than when everybody else gets them, which is usually a couple days later. Or you can buy my book. It's called Tired. It's on Amazon, and, makes a great Yule gift or whatever. If you don't want to spend the money, but you still want to help out the show, post about it on social media, whatever platform is your most favorite to use. Or just tell a friend in person. I don't know, text a link to somebody you haven't talked to in a while or something like that. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Danika. Ablation is a book I find a hard time saying how I felt about it, because I'm kind of so wrapped up in my own vocabulary about how I interact with any kind of media that sometimes I say a thing and people are like, oh, so you didn't like it then? And I'll have to be like, no, you don't understand. Ablation was really hard to read, and made me very sad and kind of hurt. And so I loved it. It's also very, very, personal, and true, I would imagine. It felt true, at least. And so, as a podcaster who has access to the writer of this book, it's hard for me to know kind of where to go, what to do with it. So we were talking in email, and I said one of the things I want to talk about is how, in general, how do you, as a person who has written something like this, approach the talking about of writing like this?
Yes. It's a great question. It's something that's come up a little bit here and there as I've started reaching out to people about reviews and interviews. So you're not the only person who's having that experience.
Cool.
The book does hurt, and it hurts because it's the book that I had to write to keep moving forward. And existing after my mom passed away rather suddenly. And it is, I did want it to feel genuine, it was coming from this genuine place, and I wanted it to feel true. Of course, it doesn't contain everything. There are things that I've held back. There are bits that I did end up cutting out. But because I wanted to capture sort of the whole experience of grief, I wasn't, and also intergenerational trauma as well, which is something that the book deals with a lot. I wasn't going to pull out some of that really difficult material because that felt dishonest, in the same way that not including a poem I make lists where I talk about all of the wonderful things that my mom also entailed. I needed to have both of those things in there. Because when I say in one of the lines in Relentless, no one is one thing or another, we're everything at once. And so I wanted, I've always kind of I find it difficult when someone is talking about or writing about grief and pain, and they sort of like either whitewash over everything that was difficult, or there's sort of like a focus on what was awful. And I wanted something that was both. But I do, I guess the thing, I don't really want people when they're like approaching the work to feel sort of like they have to be careful about approaching that vulnerability and difficulty and hurtness with me. I'd almost like, I wrote it and I know what it is, and like I put it out there. And what I do very much mean what I say in the poem Center, where the person that I was, that I'm sort of describing in the book before my mom died, and the person that I am now are not the same person. And I really do feel that way. And so I feel that the part of myself that's being described in the book is sort of separate from who I actually am now. And that gives me some, it's a kind of like a boundary where it's like I'm writing about something that to me is existing in the past. But I do hope that that sort of vulnerability that I'm sharing doesn't necessarily make someone be like, oh, I don't know how to respond to her. Like, I don't want to be hurtful to me. Like, I would almost rather they were reflective on like how it relates and brings up things in their own lives or experiences or feeling, because I don't think that our culture deals with grief or pain very well. I don't think that we hold space for it. I think it's sort of like an uncomfortable emotion. And I can feel people, like when I read some of the more difficult pieces like Swallowtail or The Nothing out loud in a room, I can feel them getting uncomfortable. And I think to a certain extent, it's good for people to feel uncomfortable and to begin to hold space for those sorts of things, and think about the fact that what's described in the book is hurtful, but it happens to a lot of people. And I've had people who have read the book already reach out to me and say things like, I had a really difficult and complicated relationship with my mom as well, and I appreciate this book. Or other people who felt that they were holding on to or like tucking into a kind of grief rather than acknowledging it. Or also people who experienced physical or verbal abuse as children, and who are basically like, this was difficult to read, but it was a sort of cathartic or releasing in a way. And so it's like worth it to me to have that sort of difficult space coming up and people not quite knowing what to say, because I think it's important to like deal with those things even though they're painful and difficult.
Yeah. I wonder if I really know exactly where my discomfort with talking about it comes from. I guess it probably is something along the lines of like, you wrote this book, clearly there's a lot of pain there among other things. Would you please open that back up for my podcast? Feels very bad to me. But sure. But also, you know, I really want to, you know, not just this work, but like confessional poetry in general, or any writing about difficult things, be able to engage with it on a deeper level than like, wow, that must have been really hard for you. Good poems though.
Right.
And like, so maybe I don't even have the capability because I'm, you know, cautious, right? About like what else, how else I would want to like dig into it. There's also the thing too that like the amount of loss I've had in my life is not on the level of, I think, a lot of people my age or around my age. Like the first of my grandparents to died in January of this year, and like was sad, but she was old.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, like, also it just had a good grandma relationship with her, right? So it was just like, all right, yep, that makes sense. That makes sense that would have happened at this point now. Okay. You know, and then life continued. So like reading Ablation was, I think, some of the things that made it tough was that I also have a young daughter. And so seeing some of that stuff is just like, oh yeah, that's right. I'm gonna have to teach her about death. And one of the more morbid thoughts that kind of cycles through my mind a lot was that my last great grandparent died when I was like 4 or 5. And then so like if my grandparents and my child are in the room together, it's like, oh, there's a ticking clock. So Ablation was like a strange like grief pregame for me, where I was just like, I'm going to have to feel a lot of this at some point. And that, you know, I guess I don't really have a value judgment on it. It's just like, oh yes, I'm going to have to feel all this at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. I think you're sort of like, I'm going to sort of talk towards the first thing you talked about first, and then a little bit towards what you said about the grandparents and having a child after. But I think this idea of like maybe reopening wounds by talking about the text or asking questions that might be difficult comes from a place of care on your part, which is like, which I appreciate. I cannot speak for anyone else writing sort of like difficult texts, but this one in particular, by the time I'm done writing it, I've pulled everything apart and put it back together so many times. And also, like, I consider the book sort of like a vessel to keep these things so that I don't have to carry them forward with me, and so that they're not carried forward through my small daughter, like along the line of the like, you know, this painful sort of line does not continue, like it stops with me. And so it's like the book is like a receptacle to put those things into. And so like at this point, I don't feel uncomfortable talking about anything that's in the book. The first few times I had to read those difficult poems out loud was very hard, but like I'm at a place now where I do feel I could answer a question and would not be hurt or like re-wounded by that. But I do think it's like comes from a good place to want to be careful around those sorts of issues. And yeah, so then talking about, you know, like this grief is something that it's like a ticking time bomb. You said like it's something that you will face. And that's the thing, is like it's something that we all face. And having this sort of like fear around it, it's like it comes from love, because you don't want to miss these people, right, who are so important. And also like we don't want your child to have to experience this sort of pain. But they do. And it's I find it better to sort of, or it's a choice that I've made to try and be honest about it and express my own feelings of grief and acknowledge those like difficult feelings to my daughter, rather than having her sort of learning that those feelings are dangerous or scary or like something to be stuffed away. I think it's sort of what I was talking about earlier, where our culture doesn't hold space for grief and pain very well. And I think it's like we want to focus on what's happy all the time, but like life is so full of all of these emotions, and they all sort of teach us something and have their own value. And there's a place and time for each of those things. But yeah, it's difficult to consider when it's like in a future.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, I had this thought recently. I can't remember what it was in reference to. Um, Maybe just general. I've been thinking a lot about like psychology and therapy and emotions and things like that, especially from a lens of being a man, um, where it's like, and I've mentioned this on the show a couple of times, but I recently learned that there is a term, and I cannot remember the term, for like emotional color blindness, which is why men sometimes have a hard time in talk therapy, because the therapist is like, well, how did that make you feel? And they genuinely are like, I don't know. I had a reaction to it that was antisocial. It's like, well, how did that make you feel? I don't know. And so, like, I've been questioning if I have language for my entire emotional range, and if I've been like putting similar but disparate emotions in the same box. And I don't know how much evidence I even have for that. It's just one of those things where it's like, you learn a new subject for the first time and you're like, oh, there's this whole other world out there to consider. The first time you learn about like Greek curse tablets and you're like, oh, the pre-modern religious landscape was way more complicated than I thought. What else could possibly be out there? And I think I'm kind of just there with like feelings. And I wonder if Ablation just kind of like dug into that a little bit, right? My reaction was just like, I was like feeling things in my body as I was reading certain poems. And it would have been really wise for me to have like marked those poems so that I could go back to them and point at them. But I think The Swallowtail was one of them. And it was just like, oh man, like I really like this book and I want to keep reading it, but like my arms feel extra heavy now. Which is like super cool, right? Like in the world of literature that I explore, there's a lot of heavy stuff. But a lot of it kind of comes from an aggressive place, right? It's a lot of like, the book is covered in sandpaper, or there's lots of gore, or there's lots of violence. I think Apocalypse Party recently posted somewhere that like they've been getting too many horror books and they want to like point out that their literature is like day ruiner literature, right? And I'm super into that. And only so much of it kind of goes into a more like, I'm gonna use like texture words, right? A lot of the stuff I was just talking about kind of feels like hard, right? Where Ablation feels like softer or gooier, right? More, I don't know. Maybe it's just because I have a harder time like kind of getting into exactly what is going on in my brain. Whereas reading, I don't know, The Devil Thinks I'm Pretty, it's like, oh, there's disgust, or there's empathy, or there's like something like that. Whereas with Ablation, it's like, there's not too many ideas I hadn't considered, but like I'm being faced with things I don't normally face.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it's interesting the way you phrase that, because it's writing the book was like facing a lot of things that I didn't normally face, like from my own life. Like it's not, I don't know that I'll write another book like it exactly, and it's not like what I've written before. or like the sorts of poems I set out to write when I was like studying and like drafting and like thinking about language poets and objectivism and stuff like that. But it was just like it was there to be like, it had to be wrestled with at the point in time at which I was doing that writing. And so then to hear that like a reader also ends up sort of facing some of these same like difficult things that they perhaps had not seen and now like also maybe struggling with. And obviously like they're everyone is going to bring their own like experience into the book and respond to things in slightly different ways. But I guess it's the sort of I do think it's important to like write from that sort, like you said, it was like a place that's like painful and dark, but like different, where it's sort of more like what did I think you said, gooey or squishy or something like. I do think that's important because they're all like there are all different kinds of horror. And sometimes I think when something is more like surreal or like removed, like when there's more skin built up between it and the core, I don't know, it's hard to it's hard to articulate, but
you're telling me. Yeah. Right. And I think like Hereditary springs to mind, right? I think the reason why that was so effective as a horror movie is because the horror was based in grief, right? Like, and so yeah, I wonder if the physical sensation in my body while watching Hereditary was similar to reading Ablation at times, because I very distinctly remember sitting in the theater and just being like, oh no, this movie's gonna feel so long. I feel like not since like a particular scene in Funny Games did I really feel that like this particular shade of bad that I don't have better words for, which is, you know, interesting, right? Because we, from a literature perspective, like we want literature that does things that are new or that you don't see a lot. And so like on the one hand, Ablation does that, and then on the other hand, like, you know, I don't even know what's in the other hand. I want to make sure, this is kind of a hard right turn, but I want to make sure we talk about the, I suppose, hybridity of the text. I say that with a question mark because I'm notably, famously unconfident when it comes to talking about poetry. But there's photographs, there's scans of other things that sort of let you into the writing process, right? Like there's photographs or scans of like note paper where collections of words that ended up in a poem are there. And I find that really interesting. And I would like to hear you talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting because the process sort of writing the book kind of started with images, or was like tied into images, and then ended up just being text. And then when I got closer to the end of drafting, I ended up being like, oh, this isn't, the words themselves aren't capturing on their own the wholeness of the experience that I want the book to like represent. And so I ended up pulling images in at that point again. So the place where they started with images is I actually started writing Ablation, which is the title sequence, when I was pregnant with my daughter years before my mom died, or I knew she was going to die, like about 2 years before, or actually it was in 2017, so 3 years. And I wrote them onto index cards originally. They're these small. I ended up turning them into mirrors and canes, but they're like these. Originally, I wrote 4 lines with 4 words in them each, and I would just take these note cards around with me and just like waiting for friends at the bar or something. Like I would write poems. But I, after that sequence, the first draft of that sequence was finished. I gave a reading in August of 2018 that was for a reading series called Hespera that was hosted by Jason Speidel and Sam Moss, who I met like many years before I met anyone else in 1111. But for that particular reading, I had sewn. So I had a whole stack of vintage postcards, and I rewrote the poems that I had written on index cards onto those postcards. And then I damaged or like embellished those postcards in various ways. Like some of them I burnt, some I dripped wax onto, some of them I sewed or cut things out of them. And I took pictures of all of those postcards before I did this, but at the reading, I read through that whole sequence and then I gave the postcards away to audience members. And so I have none of them left. But when I came back around in like the fall of 2021 and was feeling that the text alone was not capturing like the wholeness of the experience of what I wanted the book to be, I went back to those images I'd saved and I cut around some of them in Photoshop, and I put them like alongside some of those poems that were now in mirror syncane form. So some of those original images from postcards are in there. But some of the other stuff is actually comes from a different place. Like I took an online course with a wonderful poet and translator named Silvina Lopez Median in that fall of 2021 that was about images and text together. And we talked a lot of cool books. Don Mi Choi's DMZ Colony was one of them. Or Silvina's own book, Poem That Never Ends, is also a book that has like text and images in it. Or something like Knox by Anne Carson is another example. But we kind of studied that, and I had all of these materials from when my mom had passed away, just like one of the things you referred to, like the envelope that's got like a list on it. That was actually my mom had made while talking to her doctor. And I was like, gosh, this envelope has to go in there. But I also found a whole bunch of a lot of the images that I have not altered, that are like not sewn, that are in there, are from rolls of film that we found in my mom's closet that she had never developed, that were from the 1990s. And so I developed all of that film, and it was pretty messed up because if you let film sit for like decades, it'll get like there are a lot of double exposures. There are weird like flashes of light, or just like parts of the image that are just like a bright orange color because it's like not developed properly, or like there's sort of this dust or grainy dust over things that looks like a sort of like astral cloud or something. But as I was looking through those images, actually to give Mike Correo files to make the cover, which is made from one of those images, I was like, oh, some of these need to go in the book actually. And so I pulled them out and did some layouts and messed them up and gave them to Mike. And then he like messed them up way better and put them in there. But there's just something about like the failure of language to capture even emotions or feelings. Like some of what you're experiencing is not just like the whatever color blindness of emotions is. It's like the fact that we have these very strong feelings in our bodies, and our minds can't quite grapple with them, let alone like name them exactly.
Yeah.
And so having these materials that's kind of like just like archival things that I'm pulling in from those parts of time and like my life kind of filled the book out in a way that I couldn't have just with words.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think it's really successful. It's one of those things where I like kind of come to expect that a lot of these books I encounter from certain small presses are going to have things like that. And I like the very deliberateness to it in this particular one. When I had Mike on most recently, we talked about doing experimental things, and sometimes stuff just kind of gets done, right? Like it's experimental. And I really like it when there's more deliberateness to it. Another thing I really appreciated, and this is I think a great look into who I am as a person, I really appreciated how robust your notes section was. I was talking in my friend group chat about it. I was like, it's more than just this poem appeared in this place once. Like, there's context to a lot of the stuff. And you know, I think that there should be more of that. I think every piece of fiction should come with an essay by the writer about what they did and how. But I guess maybe then I'd be out of a job. But you know, I really liked it. I guess I'm curious as to why it is that way.
Yeah. Part of the reason it is that way is because I am like a collagist at heart, and that's part of the reason there's all these images and like I'm sewing things like into the book. It's part of the process. But I do less so with this because it's such a personal book. But even still, I use a lot of materials that aren't mine. Like Center uses like references the basketball player Karl Anthony Towns and like his own experience with grief. And so I wanted to make sure I was acknowledging like where I lifted that language from. Or Heart Rate Cento is like made entirely of other people's lines. And I do like even things that may seem arbitrary, like everything is garbage, like comes from an episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It was like I lifted this language from somewhere, and I feel like I need to acknowledge where it came from. And so I just as a practice, because of the way that I write, I do at the bottom, like when I draft something, I'll just like post the every time I use something else, I'll post the notes like in the bottom. Even if I like pull an oblique strategies card, like I'll note what the oblique strategies card that I used was. And part of that is just like it's just nodding to the influences that go into the work, or like some of them aren't even like me pulling direct language, but like reading Harriet Mullen's Urban Tumbleweed really affected my thinking about how that very long title sequence, like how I wanted that to operate, and the fact that it needed a form only happens because I went to this really wonderful reading where Harriet Mullen read Tonkas from Urban Tumbleweed, which is entirely a book written out of the Tonka form, which is a Japanese form. And then like on the opposite end of things, some of the poems are very tightly wound and others are more like prose. And Laura Mimosa Montez's book Thresholds was very like influential in my thinking about like what's poetry and like what's prose and what does prose allow one to do, even when something's a poem, that like the poetic line or a tight form doesn't. And so it's like, I didn't just think of those things on my own. So part of the robustness of the notes is just like being appreciative to the people whose work I've read that influenced me, and also like people who actually gave me very helpful edits as I'm drafting and revising these super difficult poems. And there's like so much care in that, because if you think the book's like tough and raw now, like read a first draft, you know. So it's I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge all of everything that gets poured into it that's not just me.